Welcome to On the Ballot with Ballotpedia, where we connect people to politics by providing neutral, nonpartisan, and reliable information on our government, how it works, and where it's headed. I'm Frank Fester, the producer of the show. Thanks for being with us. This past Tuesday, April 1st, featured some of the highest profile elections since this past November's presidential election, and in this episode, we're going to zoom in on both of those contests and the results and the implications that we can draw from them. We'll head down to Florida with Politico's Gary Fineout in just a bit to talk about a pair of special legislative elections to replace a vacant seat in both the House and the Senate. But first, I'm joined by Wisconsin Public Radio's Anya van Wagtendonk to break down Susan Crawford's victory in the state's Supreme Court election. Anya, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
So set the scene for us. Who is Susan Crawford? Tell us a little bit about her primary competitor and also the larger context surrounding the race.
Yeah, so this is a race between liberal Dane County Judge Susan Crawford and conservative Waukesha County Judge Brad Schimmel. Susan Crawford emerged victorious last night. She won by about 10 points. She has been a district judge in Dane County, as I mentioned, that's home to the capital city of Madison, a really kind of liberal stronghold. In the past, she represented liberal clients and worked for a liberal law firm. She represented Planned Parenthood. She represented unions, and she also worked for former Democratic Governor Jim Doyle when he was governor. She was his general counsel. Before that, actually, he was attorney general. She was his assistant attorney general. So has this kind of long liberal and Democratic backed lineage. And then Brad Schimmel has a kind of similar conservative lineage. He was a prosecutor, he was a district attorney, he was a state Republican attorney general for one term, and he's in Waukesha County, which is a conservative sort of suburban county district right outside of Milwaukee. So going into this race, it was really I mean, this has been repeated over and over. It was the most expensive judicial race in American history, and you could really kind of feel that and see that on the ground here. You could not turn on your computer or Instagram or your TV without seeing ads. My mailbox was stuffed with flyers literally every single day. It was a really kind of significant campaign. And then last night wrapped up with a 10-point victory for Susan Crawford.
Were people expecting this race to be closer? I didn't think it was considered necessarily to be a toss-up, but a 10-point spread is a pretty big win for Crawford, right?
It is a landslide by Wisconsin standards, first of all, but even still, it is a surprisingly big margin of victory. I think going into it, the expectation was that it was going to be quite close and certainly closer than the last kind of big high-profile Supreme Court race that we had here in 2023. That one was decided by 11 points. That was considered this sort of, enormous victory. Going into this one, we did not expect it to be, sort of so significant in the same way, in part because, as I mentioned, Brad Schimmel was a statewide office holder before, so he had more name recognition than the previous
Right.
conservative candidate. He ran a different type of campaign. He took money from the Republican Party in the way that, his predecessor did not. So there were all of these different factors that, as you say, we thought pointed to the fact that this is going to be closer. And in fact, I spoke with a member of Crawford's team who told me even they did not expect the race to be called quite so early in the night. It was called a little over an hour after polls closed. So
Oh,
the
wow.
night wrapped up kind of quickly.
Yeah, and I'm sure you were excited to go to bed a little bit earlier than you expected to. So what did turnout look like? That was kind of a big question mark looming over this race. Would the enthusiasm that was maybe drum up during the general election last November carry over to this election and that those elections, in Florida and elsewhere around the country that we'll talk about a little bit later in the show. But what did turnout look like?
Yeah, that was another I keep bringing up the 2023 election because that was really the first time that we saw these kind of unprecedented fundraising numbers, unprecedented turnout numbers, and then this one on both of those counts really kind of knocked the last one out of the water, which knocked every other race out of the water, and so in 2023, we saw unprecedented April turnout of about 1.8 million, and then by comparison, this election had about 2.3 more than 2.3 million voters come out. And so, I mean, that's just crazy for an April election. It's an off year election. It's a judicial race. There were some other statewide races on the ballot, but nothing at this level. So that's just really significant. And one of the kind of things that bumped Crawford over the edge is that she outperformed Kamala Harris in basically every corner of the state, potentially every county. We're still kind of breaking down those numbers, but she outperformed her both in the sort of Democratic strongholds, and then also she picked up counties that Trump won in November.
Talk to me a little bit more about the enthusiasm. I know, there's the obvious context of the implications of the race, and we'll get to that in a little bit for, pending Supreme Court cases in the state. What are people thinking when it comes to the enthusiasm related to the race? What was kind of driving turnout?
I mean, I actually had this question because one of the things I was hearing when I talked to voters was also a little bit of exhaustion. Like, we are just such a campaigned to state. There's always an election going on in Wisconsin. And so I was hearing some level of kind of fatigue, but that did not translate, obviously, to turnout. And so I think it was sort of a multitude of factors. One thing was the stakes of what this court could decide, and we'll get into that in a bit. But broadly speaking, the ideological balance of the court was at play. And so I think insofar as voters turn out for this, they understood that this is going to turn the court either conservative if Schimmel had won or maintain the liberal majority if and when Crawford won. And so I think that was kind of a significant driver of things. And then the other really significant component here was the arrival of Elon Musk, who spent more than $20 million backing the conservative candidate, Brad Schimmel. That means roughly one in every $5 that was spent was a Musk dollar. And I think that really it drove some amount of conservative participation for sure. It just drew more attention into the race, but it also motivated a lot of liberal voters sort of against this out-of-state billionaire showing up and spending money here.
And I'm curious, before we get into some of those national implications, talk to us about some of the upcoming legal and political fights that could come before the court in the coming months and coming years, obviously. How are the results of this race affecting how people are thinking about those outcomes?
Yeah, I think, the most significant issue with judicial races nationwide, I think, has been abortion, and that's the case here as well. And so there is currently an active case before the Supreme Court that would decide the status of abortion in Wisconsin. Without getting too into it, we had a trigger law that went into effect after Roe versus Wade was overturned, and then a lower court decision sort of undid that. And so now the Supreme Court will hear whether that lower court or decide whether that lower court decision stands and whether abortion is legal in the state of Wisconsin. So that's very motivating, particularly to Democratic and liberal voters, but also even to a majority of Wisconsin voters do believe in abortion rights. So that's the most significant one. The timing of that is unclear. Whether Crawford now will be on the bench when that finishes up, unclear. Another really kind of major decision here is has to do with Act 10, and that is the Governor Scott Walker's sort of signature law that undid collective bargaining rights for most public union workers. You may recall enormous protests about 15 years ago where people took over the Capitol building in Wisconsin. Democratic lawmakers fled the state to deny a quorum to like pass this law. It was a huge, huge deal at the time. That law might also get undone. A lower court decision ruled it unconstitutional, so this court will weigh in on that. And of note, actually, Crawford has a background, as I mentioned, representing Planned Parenthood and teachers unions, and so she has sort of signaled where she stands on some of those issues. Another thing that came up during the campaign was the possibility of congressional redistricting. That is not a lawsuit that's been filed, but that's the kind of thing that really does rev up, obviously, national donors and national interest. And so that was a subject of conversation is that a lawsuit at this point could get filed challenging our congressional maps, and that could potentially change at least two seats here.
Wow, so yeah, there is a lot going on in Wisconsin and a lot to look out for there, well, as there always is, right? What has some of the national reaction been to the story? What are you noticing either from your reporting, what you're consuming in the media? Kind of how are, both the parties reacting and, where things go from here?
Yeah, Democrats are definitely kind of spinning this as a major victory for them, as sort of a referendum on the first couple of months of the Trump White House, and particularly of the sort of Musk-Trump alignment at the White House. And so earlier today, the DNC chair and the chair of the Wisconsin Democratic Party held a press call, and they really talked about this as kind of a nationwide victory, or signaling kind of nationwide wind at the back of Democrats. And Ben Wickler, chair of the Wisconsin Democratic Party, literally said, I hope Elon Musk keeps coming out and campaigning for Republicans because he repels voters, is the line that he used. So really strong language and really kind of gleeful language, I would say, on the part of Democrats. Republicans here are not obviously, I think buying into that argument. They say they're not. They say that they are looking towards the midterm elections. They point to ways that they built out their campaigning power, their canvassing power, their fundraising power, and so they're really saying all of that is going to give them a lot of momentum going into the 2026 midterms.
All right, there's a lot to watch there, both in Wisconsin and nationally. Wisconsin Public Radio's Anya Van Wagtendonk, thank you so much again for coming on the show on short notice. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Now let's shift our focus down south to Florida, where two state legislative seats were up for grabs in special elections this week, one in the House and one in the Senate. I'm joined now by Politico Florida's Gary Fineout. Gary, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me. I'm glad to be here.
So, can you introduce our listener to the context surrounding this race and the story leading up to Election Day?
Well, sure. I mean, it actually kind of starts with the election of Donald Trump back in November. And as people may have noticed, the president is, adopted Florida as his home. And basically, his people have decided to kind of tap a lot of Florida people in the administration. And so one of the first dominoes to drop was Matt Gaetz, who is a longtime Republican from the Panhandle, and I'm sure most people have some familiarity with him and everything from the Speaker McCarthy situation to his ethics investigation. There's a lot of things going on there. But as you recall, the president tapped him to become Attorney General of the United States, and he resigned from the House. And at first, we weren't sure how that was all going to play out because he got reelected in November, then like right after that resigned and said he would not serve in the Congress for the rest of the year. And kind of everyone was like, well, does that mean he could come back in January? So that was all kind of fuzzy. But in the end, as we know, Gates did not become Attorney General, but he had already resigned. And so his seat needed to be filled. And then the president tapped Michael Waltz, a Republican from part of Northeast Florida over on the Atlantic coast, tapped him to be national security advisor. So in essence, we had two Republican seats that came open because of the departures due to the victory of Trump. This sort of set off a bit of a scramble, because open Republican seats don't normally, and I say Republicans because they were viewed as Republican seats because of their performance over the last
Right.
bunch of election cycles. And so they opened up. And what happened is that right at the kind of onset of when them opening up, Trump endorsed two people. He endorsed Jimmy Patronis, who is a longtime kind of mainstay here in Tallahassee. He is in a post that's known as chief financial officer. That is actually an elected position. It has a lot of duties, but primarily it's the person with the state's checkbook. They've got some role in insurance and things of that nature, but they are it's statewide elected position. And the chief financial officer also serves on what we have in Florida is we have a cabinet. The cabinet does some things with the governor, but the cabinet, all those officials in the cabinet are elected on their own. They do not work for the governor. All right. So Petronis got an endorsement from Trump. And then there was a state senator, Randy Fine, who had been in the House for the last 8 years. He had just gotten elected to the state Senate in November, and Trump wound up endorsing him for the other seat, the seat that had been held by Mike Waltz. So those were the two guys that Trump said, I'm giving you my complete and unqualified endorsement. And then we were off. Now, then we had Republican primaries because the, Florida has a process, and I think different states do things differently. You have to space out the elections. You have the primaries in the Republican and Democratic side, then you have the general election. And what we had on Tuesday was the final general election. The primary was earlier this year, and Petronis and Fine both won their primaries, and then they rolled on. So what happened though of late was there was polling and there was money, and all of a sudden I think there was a situation where Republicans became somewhat concerned about the performance. And, there's a lot of issues around that, and we can discuss that a little bit further. But, in terms of how everyone was kind of viewing it, and there were some differing opinions. Uh, Governor Ron DeSantis, for his part, uh, he doesn't get along with Randy Fine. They had a bit of a falling out over multiple things, and the governor kept saying, "Well, if Republicans don't do well in that one seat, it's because of Randy Fine." And anyway, so that's sort of the backstory. I hope I didn't go into too much depth, but yeah, that's how kind of how we got up to right now, up to the election.
No, well, that's good context to have. I appreciate you going in depth there for sure. But tell us a little bit about the results in both elections. Were they what people expected? Were they closer than what they were expecting? What did that all look like?
Everyone anticipated that these were going to be seats that remain Republican. That was the sort of operating theory going in. And it was based upon the fact that people like the President Trump and Governor DeSantis had performed quite well. Now, as we know, special elections are kind of unique creatures in terms of the way that they work. You don't know what kind of turnout you're going to get, how are people going to respond. It is outside the normal cycle. Um, but the situation is, and I know there are a lot of theories about it, and part of it is aimed at, growing dissatisfaction in the Democratic base about responding to Trump and whether or not more is doing. Something interesting happened. Josh Will and Gabe Valamont basically significantly outraised the Republicans,
Hmm.
at least directly, Fine directly and what and Petronas. And so Valamont outraised Petronas 3-1. And for Fine, it was like nearly 8-1, 9-1. That was the first kind of danger flare that went up for the Republicans. Is like, oh my gosh, these Democrats are getting a lot of money. And then I think then what added to it is that a pollster of President Trump's did some polling in the District 6. That's the one on the Atlantic coast that had been held by Waltz. Did some polling that indicated that Randy Fine was within the margin of error or around the margin of error in polling. So if you're looking at a seat that had been won by 30 points by the president or 30 plus points by the president, and suddenly you've got a Republican who's kind of in the margin of error, yeah, that set off alarm bells. And so you had the president wound up doing telehalls. You had a bunch of groups, including to a small extent Elon Musk, coming in, and I believe in the end, a lot of money was spent in the CD6 race involving Fine. That the Between the outside groups and Fine, I think they came close to matching the money that the Democratic candidate had. But still, it was this all hands on deck kind of thing that happened in the last 1 to 2 weeks, where the Republicans, who in Florida are very well known for being able to sort of jazz up turnout,
Sure.
they were able to go ahead and get. But when you looked at the final numbers that came out on Tuesday, they were, you know, they were considerably closer than I think people saw. And what was interesting is everyone kind of focused a lot on that CD6 race with Randy Fine. Um, but the more interesting result happened in Congressional District 1, the one that had been held by Gates. Now, let's understand, Gates won this election huge last time, even in November. And basically, what you had is Gay Valamont, the Democratic candidate, she flipped Escambia County, and that's an area that's in the most western part of the Panhandle. It includes the city of Pensacola. The fact that she lost the election, but she flipped this, you know, ruby red Republican county, that's noteworthy because again, not expecting that this would happen.
I haven't seen a lot of reporting at the county level yet, at least when it comes to the results in Florida. That's super interesting. Gary, are any of the other counties sticking out to you as either being, a surprise outcome or flipping, anything like that?
To me, that was the biggest one. I mean, it's because in the last couple of elections, what we've had is we've seen Republicans actually sort of um, claiming more and more. Um, they've been claiming more and more counties that used to be considered purple or blue or
Sure.
and so that had been the trend. And in fact, part of what was noticed was, you know, counties like Miami-Dade flipping in the presidential election, and other counties that had been sort of in the purple bracket or in the blue bracket, they had flipped in both the 22 elections where DeSantis was reelected and in the 24 election. So, I mean, I guess something I didn't sort of mention at the onset is that we've had a real sea change in Florida over the last a few years with DeSantis, and what I mean by that is that there was the Democrats actually there were more Democrats registered to vote, active. It's called active registrations. More Democrats were registered to vote in Florida ahead of the 2018 election when DeSantis was elected the first time.
Hmm.
We are now in a situation where Republicans have a 1.2 million voter advantage in registration. And so this has been this incredible shift in the last 6 years. So that gives you a tremendous advantage. And so what we've seen is we have seen this sort of trend where places that used to be, the Democrats used to be competitive in have now gone the other way. And so to see a Republican county and a Republican county that has been that way for a long time to flip is still interesting. And now I got it. It's a special election. And, there's everything and all the caveats that come with that. But the thing is that Gabe Alamont, she ran an interesting campaign in the sense that she focused on some parochial issues. She really went hard after Jimmy Patronis over insurance, which has been an ongoing frustration among Floridians is the problems with insurance and premium increases and things of that nature. And he has a role as a statewide official where he kind of helps regulates insurance. So she went after him on that, but she also spent time talking about, Elon Musk and talking about Trump and talking about Doge and talking about budget cuts and talking about what kind of impact that was going to have on veterans and people who rely on the government. So, I think it's a marker to say, okay, is this a strategy that you might use going forward? Now, I will say, I do want to stop to say, of course, from a Republican standpoint, they're like, look, a win is a win is a win.
That's
You
what I was
know,
about to ask you about, Gary. Let me slip a question in here before I let you go. Can you tell us a little bit about the reaction so far, both locally and nationally, either by both parties or what you're learning in the early stages of your reporting?
I would tell you one interesting reaction again has been Governor DeSantis is he was asked about that right after the election and results were known. And he once again said, well, in the terms of Randy Fine, he was bailed out by the president. He would have lost if it hadn't been for the intervention. And he basically said, he got all these resources. And he kind of said, well, Petronas still got outspent. And we need to remember that. We need to, that. And so, I mean, DeSantis has put the close margin with Randy Fine. And again, I want to say close more. I mean, Randy Fine still won by double digits. It's not. It's just a matter he didn't win by 30 plus points.
Right.
It's a matter of he's saying this is a reflection of the candidate, and he doesn't go with what he calls media spin that this is some sort of rebuke to Trump and his agenda. And then we're gonna, obviously everyone's gonna move forward and see what happens. Obviously, you know, a lot, I guess, for Democrats and Republicans, I guess they're talking a lot more about what happened in Wisconsin and not in Florida. But still, it is noteworthy given the fact that these both of these seats were seen to be sort of like, several months ago were seen to be okay. This is just, Republicans are just going to run roughshod and there's nothing to see here.
Gary, I should have asked, how do you pronounce your last name?
It's Fineout.
Find out.
It's
Okay.
it's find out, but with an E.
Find out is a great name, a last name for a journalist.
Thank you.
Gary's going to find out. I'm sure you've heard that before.
I have.
Professional on my end.
I'm gonna confess, yes, I have heard it before.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. I'm glad we could have you on the show. Really appreciate you coming on.
No, I appreciate it. I hope I did okay for you.
Definitely. And for our listeners, you can learn more about both of these elections at the links in our show notes. We'll be back next week with another episode. Make sure you subscribe to On the Ballot wherever you listen to podcasts. I'm Frank Festa, and thanks for listening.